want to take some time and talk about Jimmy Carter. And when people talk about Jimmy Carter, of course, it's like, hey, you start with the guy's presidency. But you know what? We want to look at his life more in depth, more than just being the president or the peanut farmer. So Jimmy Carter starts his story in Plains, Georgia. This is where he was born on October 1st of 1924. And he grew up in the rural community of Archery. And the background of being from, the small town area, well, that all really mattered to him because Carter, coming out of that small town world, the farming world, really shaped by all this was shaped by work and the importance of religion and family, and add to that the realities of the segregated South. That even later, when he ends up in the White House or when he's post-president and he's working on global diplomacy, all of those things from the Plains, Georgia area stayed with him as he went through his life. Now, Carter's path to politics was not something that happened immediately. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1946. He married Rosalind Smith that same year, and then he served as a naval officer before returning to Georgia after his father's death in order to help run the family business. Now, that return home really turned out to be quite decisive because it rooted him back into the local life of the Plains area, and it eventually pushed him toward public service through school board work and then state politics. And Carter didn't just come up through some kind of national power network. He actually rose up, from local leadership in a small community all the way up to become the governor of Georgia. So with those ties to, the local government and the state government, Carter's political rise was actually surprisingly fast. He served in the Georgia Senate, and like I said, he became the governor of Georgia in 1971. And by 1976, he had really turned himself into kind of a serious national candidate. And part of what made him really stand out was more or less just timing. The country was going through the controversy of Watergate, and Carter was presenting himself as an outsider. He was a man that seemed honest and decent, who wasn't really deeply tied to Washington. And that message resonated with Americans. And in 1976, he defeated the incumbent Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter becomes the 39th president of the United States. Now, of course, Carter's presidency, which was one term, it lasted from 77 to 81, is best remembered being complicated because you had, on the one hand, he helped broker the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel in 1978, and that's, of course, one of the most important diplomatic achievements of the late 20th century. But on the other hand, his presidency is weighed down by things like inflation, the energy problems that existed in the United States, and then, of course, the Iran hostage crisis. And those things in combination all damaged public confidence, and it really helped define the end of his time in office as the president. And Carter's presidency is one of those cases where real achievement and political struggle all existed side by side. I think something that makes Jimmy Carter especially unusual is that his great historical importance may have come after he left the presidency. Now, I'm not the first person to say that, of course. Many historians have said it. So in 1982, he and his wife, Rosalind, founded the Carter Center. And the Carter Center became a major force in things like election monitoring around the world, conflict mediation, public health, human rights work, those things. It had an international scope. And through that work, Carter helped redefine what a former president could be. He was no longer just a retired political figure that was out on the speech circuit. He became an active international humanitarian. And that post-presidential legacy was recognized in a very public way when Jimmy Carter received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. And the Nobel Committee honored him for decades of work in peace negotiation, human rights, social welfare. And in some ways, the Nobel Prize really captured what made Jimmy Carter quite distinctive, because he wasn't being honored mainly for having been president. He was being honored for what he did with that the decades that followed when he left office. And another major part of Jimmy Carter's later legacy was public health. The Carter Center became deeply involved with the fight against Guinea, Africa, all these things helped drive down cases from millions annually in the 1980s to extraordinarily low numbers decades later. It was really his life's goal to see that no one would ever suffer from this terrible affliction again. And that kind of work is less dramatic than things like electoral politics. But it is one reason why Carter's post-presidency is often viewed so favorably. He attached his name and his energy to efforts that really produced measurable human results. And we can't forget all the work that he did through Habitat for Humanity, and so many images of him, working on job sites with building affordable housing for those who really happen to need it. Now, Jimmy Carter died on December 29th of 2024. He was at his home in Plains, Georgia, and he made it to the age of 100. And his life really ended where it began. And there's really something that's very fitting about that. He'd been president, a Nobel laureate, a mediator, a humanitarian, a teacher, especially a Sunday school teacher in his church, and a public moral voice, and just a decent man. But Plains remained central to how he understood himself. And that's probably the best way to understand Jimmy Carter in the end, not just as a former president, but as a public servant whose life connected, his local roots to an idea of global responsibility. Thanks for watching.